And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
President.
Yes, sir.
Hi, folks. Welcome to Monks and Punks. Again, I'm your host, Sander Hicks. We have a very special guest today, and I'm so proud. It might be the most legit American historian we've ever had. It's Mike Koncewicz.
Yes.
Originally Koncewicz, but his grandfather assimilated and got rid of the Slavic Polish. Is that Polish?
It is Polish. Yeah.
Excellent.
I think he thought it would be easier pronounced, but that was pretty.
You didn't know, so there's so many Poles like me and my family, my background. So Yak Shamash, Dobrze Dobrze, Dziękuję. Thank you for coming on Monks and Punks. Mike is a friend of the family. He's a friend of mine. He's the author of The Men Who Said No, Republicans Who Stood Up to Richard Nixon. And we're living in a time in which, with Trump trying to control the narrative about everything, we have a lot of Nixon revisionism going on. So it's a great time to wake up to what's happening with people trying to control history and talk about this Nixon revisionism, or I guess you could say Trump makes Nixon look good, right?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways that's true, but we can have I think a deeper, more substantive conversation about, what's actually interesting about comparing the two.
Yeah.
And I always caution people to not kind of slide down that slippery slope of saying, oh, well, not even Nixon would have done this. Well, if Nixon was born in the 1940s or 50s instead of 1913, who knows what he would be? I have my own guess, but he would probably be just as, he would at least be in the same ballpark as what Trump is doing right now.
Right. So your personal opinion is that as presidents go, and this is your job as a historian, would you say Trump is worse, or Trump in some ways? Is Trump more an authoritarian?
Yes, I think that's fair to say. I think what's complicated about Nixon is he was an authoritarian. He had strong authoritarian instincts, but he also cared about presidential norms. He had that inner voice that told him he could be the next Teddy Roosevelt. And the next Teddy Roosevelt, even though, your listeners know that he was a problematic figure in his own right, Teddy Roosevelt was one of those iconic foundational presidents. And that's what Nixon wanted to be. And I think that impacts even the final days of Watergate, the final days of his presidency, and explains why he resigns, explains why he turns over the tapes. He wanted to be a normal president. And because he had that desire, it kept his authoritarianism in check. Now, that's a pretty fragile check, but nonetheless, it's part of the story. Donald Trump, with a few exceptions, doesn't seem to care about any of that. And
Right.
so I think that it's fair to say that puts us on more dangerous territory. I'm biased as someone who spends too much time listening to the Nixon tapes. I have my own, pretty negative view of Nixon. I have a pretty negative take on Nixon, on most things Nixon, so I'm biased. However, I think it's fair to say we're in a much more dangerous time than we were in the 1960s, 1970s. Regardless of what you think about each individual, our political culture is worse. It's more vindictive, and it's more open to right-wing authoritarianism, which is dominating our current political culture.
Well, I got to commend you for delivering a wonderful lecture. It's on YouTube, St. Francis College. And at the end of it, this 71-year-old lady scolds you for calling 71-year-olds elderly. And you're very deferential. You're kind to her about that point. And then she scolds you for focusing too much on Nixon. And it's FDR and blah, blah, blah. And you are not so differential. And you say, I have listened to the tapes, and they put me in a bad mood. I had to listen to them every Friday night, and I wasn't the best husband to my wife. I was in such a foul mood because of the 24/7 cynicism and the 24/7 politics and the constant scheming. And so there's like an idealism. Part of the research for doing this episode is I really looked at there's a TED Talk, historical overview of Nixon, which is also very critical. It talks about Nixon's accomplishments, but it really talks about his violation of the Mann Act and his prolonging the Vietnam War and the vindictiveness, the personal vindictiveness and the international vindictiveness. So I think you've brought out the toxicity of Nixon. So how does this compare to what we deal with today with Nixon revisionism?
Oh, well, I mean, and I've written about this recently for Time Magazine. I think it's worth acknowledging that there is a new wave of Nixon revisionism. Arguably since 1974 when Nixon resigns, there are those who are trying to fight for Nixon's legacy, who want to rehabilitate his presidency. In the late 20th century, there was a wave of Nixon revisionism from liberal scholars who were making the argument, hey, maybe Nixon wasn't so bad, given what they got from Ronald Reagan and even to a certain extent Bill Clinton. But this new wave of Nixon revisionism may be more consequential, and it's certainly more troubling. And that's because it's being embraced primarily by younger conservatives, including some prominent figures like Christopher Rufo. Tucker Carlson has devoted long segments of his Twitter show, or a show on X with Nixon Watergate conspiracy theorists. And then, I don't know how you'd ideologically label him, but Joe Rogan has even embraced his own kind of brand of Nixon revisionism. Worth focusing on is, why are they drawn to Nixon? And they're drawn to Nixon because he's seen as a martyr for the cause, and a martyr who was brought down by the deep state. And it's a pretty easy narrative to digest. Nixon wins in a landslide in the 1972 election. He defeats the progressive Democratic Senator, George McGovern, who people may remember stood for, the caricature was that he stood for acid, amnesty, and abortion. And he was seen as too far to the left. So Richard Nixon wins more than 60% of the popular vote and wins almost every single state in the Electoral College. It's one of the largest landslides in American history, and it's something that devastates liberal baby boomers still to this day. Nixon has that resounding victory in the fall of 72, and then he resigns less than 2 years later. How does that happen? Well, if you ask Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan or other, kind of younger Nixon revisionists, it's because the deep state brought him down. Nixon was the victim of a CIA orchestrated coup. And these stories will often focus on Bob Woodward's own ties to the Navy and the CIA. And they'll say, look at all this smoke. This means that Richard Nixon, much like JFK or these other figures from the mid to late 20th century, was brought down by the same exact deep state. He was a president who wanted to challenge that deep state in different ways, and that's what we should be focusing on. Regardless of what one feels about the history of, the deep state in the United States, it totally obscures what Richard Nixon is doing throughout his presidency, particularly between 1971 and 1974. It obscures the fact that the men who broke into the Watergate burglary, sure, they have pretty shady backgrounds, whether it's E. Howard Hunt or G. Gordon Liddy. You don't need to tell me that these are suspicious figures. Well, Richard Nixon signs off on using them. And so Richard Nixon, I mean, we can have, I think, a nuanced conversation about this, but you need to acknowledge that Richard Nixon was very interested in using these different deep state figures for his own means. And none of these revisionists really acknowledge that, and they never acknowledge the Nixon's guilt. Documented facts that show that Nixon was actively trying to obstruct justice. And why? Well, it was totally logical. He was trying to obstruct justice. He was trying to cover up all of the unethical and unconstitutional and sometimes outright illegal things that he either was directly connected to or indirectly connected to.
Absolutely. And on the Nixon tapes, when Nixon talks about that whole Bay of Pigs thing, I'm sure you've heard that in his own words. Is he talking about the JFK assassination per se, and Bay of Pigs is a euphemism for the JFK assassination that he was kind of in town for that day in Dallas?
Yeah, and a lot of people are in town. I mean, I know there's a lot of people focus on George H.W. Bush and what did he remember from that day. I mean, and when it comes to Nixon's reference to the Bay of Pigs thing, it could be about the Kennedy assassination, but when we're talking about Cuba in 1961, it could be a lot of things. Certainly, Nixon said a few things that hinted at some sort of, awareness of the Kennedy assassination, but there's not really a smoking gun when it comes to that. I know certain people bring up that perhaps the famous 18.5 minute gap may be about the Kennedy assassination. I don't buy that one. I think Nixon was too concerned with his own personal drama. That's probably that gap, if I had to guess, is probably related to the so-called Chanel affair, where Richard Nixon was trying to sabotage the peace talks while he was running for president in 1968 to
Right.
prolong the Vietnam War. I think that's a more logical explanation based on just how worried Nixon was about what dirt the Democrats had on him in 1972.
Right.
Nevertheless, yeah, Nixon had some sort of awareness of something related to the Kennedy assassination, but it's still a bit of a mystery exactly what he thought.
Right. I just did some research too about this, trying to figure out if this is kind of going down a rabbit hole a little bit. So tell me if you'd rather steer me away from this. And I did listen to Tucker Carlson talking to Joe Rogan, and as conspiracy theories go, it's kind of light. It's very flimsy. It's a lot of like, oh, I think I have a feeling. It's a lot of inference. It's not evidence, and so. You could be basing it on actual facts like E. Howard Hunt. Not only is he a major player in the Watergate break-in, he was also in the CIA in the Mexican embassy.
Mhm.
And there's some controversy. Did Oswald actually visit the Mexican embassy, or was it a duplicate? And it turns out on the great internet, there are people who say, yes, it was, and we know exactly who it was. And then there was a Fort Worth gun runner who was tied to Sergio Arcacha Smith, who was actually a Nixon pal. I don't know if you ever heard of Sergio Arcacha Smith. All right, then
No, I haven't.
that's kind of a rabbit hole that we don't have to go down. Let's talk about Martha Mitchell, who was the wife of John Mitchell, the former Attorney General of the U.S. She was recently depicted in a film by Julia Roberts. She was a hard-drinking, loose-lipped but charismatic person who kind of was a Republican, almost like one of the women who said no, because she was like kind of like the men who said no in your book. She was outspoken. And in the movie, there's some interesting. She dies mysteriously, and Frank McCord, the Watergate burglar, brings up the fact that the head of the NTSB had been fired that same day. I don't know if that's something that's relevant to our topic today.
Martha Mitchell or her death or
Yeah, the death. I mean, it was a bizarre death, and Nixon fired the head of the NTSB like the same day. And
really? I actually did not know that.
yeah, yeah.
So-
Um, and let's talk a little bit more about the Nixon tapes.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean Martha. To return to Martha Mitchell, though, I mean she's a fascinating figure. I would understand anyone's suspicions about her death, given just how vocal she was, and during the final year or two of Watergate. But
She
no,
had
yeah,
she was part of the conduit of cash coming out of the Nixon White House
yes.
to pay cover up hush money so that people like G. Gordon Liddy would go to prison and not talk.
Yeah, and I think what she was justifiably afraid of was that Nixon and and his inner circle, which at various points included John Mitchell, were going to throw John Mitchell under the bus and try to pin Watergate on him, since there was much more direct evidence linking to him to the Watergate burglary. And so that was her incentive in terms of why she wanted to talk to reporters, both off and on the record. And John Dean was in a very similar situation the very next year. I mean, each of these guys thought it was incredibly unfair, given the culture that Nixon set in the White House, that they were going to take all the blame for Watergate. And once, like I said, that's why I think it's very important to drill down on what Nixon is actually doing. Because then you could see Nixon's at the center of all this. This is not just a bunch of kooky characters doing their own things, and maybe some of them were working against the president to try to bring him down. No, you need to focus on what Nixon's actually saying on the tapes, what he's ordering, and some of the ideas that actually came straight from him. This was not just the story of G. Gordon Liddy being weird and eccentric and possibly some sort of operative who was working against him.
I think I know the answer to my next question, which is, look, and I want you to tell me more, what were the nefarious schemes that came directly from Richard Nixon? But I think one of them is the enemies list, which is Nixon pushing to use the IRS against just Paul Newman and run-of-the-mill Hollywood celebrities and anti-war liberals, and right. And Nixon was always following up with the head of the IRS and George Shultz, and they were saying, just no. We're not going to respond to Ehrlichman, and we're not going to do it because it's an illegal use of the IRS.
Yeah, and that's something that Nixon, I mean, archival records, not just the tapes, there's paper records that show that Nixon's at the center of that order. This is not coming from John Ehrlichman, his top domestic advisor, or H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff. No, it's coming straight from Richard Nixon. And that's very clear. To bring up, previous presidents and what was done before Nixon, I'm not one to romanticize the federal bureaucracy or even the IRS. I mean, there were cases where people were targeted for their politics, typically on the left if we're talking about the mid 20th century, but even some cases on the extreme right. But those were cases that were a little bit murkier. They were organizations that, you could have a debate about whether or not they violated their tax exempt status. And sure, there was definitely politics at hand in different cases. So I'm not denying that. What's different about this is Richard Nixon wanted to take whatever had been going on in the IRS for decades and control it straight from the Oval Office and target individuals. And that's what makes him exceptional. That's not to say that individuals weren't targeted beforehand, but you never had a list of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of individuals whose only crime were opposing the Nixon presidency. And yes, this included people like Paul Newman, included, other Hollywood actors, included journalists that Nixon just disliked. And then it also included anti-war activists, civil rights activists, anyone who was on the president's shit list. And what Nixon came very close to doing was getting the IRS to actually take this list and initiate mass audits. If we had a different IRS commissioner, it may have happened. But fortunately for the country, Johnny Walters, a Republican from South Carolina, with the support of his supervisor, George Shultz, then Secretary of the Treasury, they blocked that order from happening. If Nixon had a full second term and may have been able to remove both Shultz and Walters, who knows what could have happened? Because they were there, Nixon is furious, and you can hear this on the tapes. He's furious at George Shultz. He's furious about Johnny Walters, and he's wondering why their kind of mole within the IRS, they have this mid-level mole, isn't getting more work done. Well, it's because his boss is blocking all of its attempts to go after all those Democratic donors that they want to target. And so the reason I think that this story is so important is it shows that the president of the United States, not just his underlings, is at the center of this attempt to completely politicize the IRS.
Right. How does that compare to Trump? Because Trump is also politicizing all kinds of branches of government. I don't know, does Trump have an enemies list the way that Nixon had an enemies list?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he does, but I guess the counter to that is, well, why would he even need one at this point? As far as we can tell, everyone involved in the second Trump administration has every incentive to just target people who are understood as enemies. I don't even know if you need an enemies list. So just thinking this out loud, the culture that created the enemies list has taken over much of the Republican Party in the last 10 to 15 years.
Right.
And so we're living through a moment where you're not going to really have a smoking gun because there's this understanding that you use presidential power, you use the federal bureaucracy to screw your enemies. And why wouldn't you? And I think there's going to be probably moments, if we're lucky, where maybe the majority of the public is vocally disturbed by what's happening. It does seem like, a large share of the American public is okay with using the government to go after your enemies.
I know the Nixon Foundation has published a short video in which Richard Nixon says that a good president never crosses Israel. You have to stand with Israel no matter what. And yet the Nixon tapes have Nixon often referring to the East Coast Jews, the Jews and the New York Times. So do you believe, in having listened to many hours of the tapes, how many hours have you listened to of the...
I mean, my best estimate, and this is just based on my notes, and it could be slightly off, but I think it's around probably 250 to 300 hours. So that'd
Yeah.
be about close to 10% of what's accessible to the public.
Did you consistently hear evidence that Nixon was an anti-Semite?
Oh, yes. Yeah. And I wasn't even looking for it. It wasn't a focus of my research, but it came up over and over again. And not just an anti-Semite. The guy was, and this is to your previous comment about like Nixon's cynicism. His racism is also, I think, maybe less exceptional, but still it's up there in terms of American presidents. He's obsessed with ranking people based on their ethnicity, based on their race, even sometimes their religion. It comes up a lot. I've listened to some of the Johnson tapes, and Johnson will say things that are racist, but it's not to dismiss it, but compared to Nixon, it's far more casual. It's certainly disturbing in its own way, but it's not as rooted in creating a racial hierarchy. Whereas Nixon is clearly interested in that. He's always trying to find ways to understand people in a very superficial way, and part of that is looking at their race, ethnicity, or the religion. And yeah, his anti-Semitism comes out quite a bit. It's particularly strong when he's hanging out with his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman. They're both Southern California guys, and there's a history of Southern Californian anti-Semitism. Others, particularly Jewish individuals who worked for Nixon, who worked in the Nixon White House, would kind of explain it as a way as when Richard Nixon refers to Jews, he's actually talking about liberal elites. He's not just talking about Jews.
It's a euphemism. It's a
Yeah, this is an argument that William Safire used to make. And William Safire, who later on became a very influential New York Times columnist, was one of Nixon's speechwriters.
That's right.
Alongside, another anti-Semite like Pat Buchanan. But he was part of the speechwriting team. And yeah, I've heard that argument from other people that Nixon is just letting off steam about liberal, intellectuals. He's not actually targeting Jews. I don't buy that. Because the anti-Semitism comes up quite frequently. And I think the American public only knows about, they only maybe know about a fraction of the story. There's one tape that, for whatever reason, hasn't been publicized by scholars, and I'll talk about it right here.
That's good because I was going to ask you, what's the thing that really hit you that like more people need to know this?
Yeah. So I wish I looked up the exact date, but I want to say it's late 1972, probably December of 1972. A German choir, it was a young boys choir from Germany, came to the White House. And I don't even remember why they were there, but they gave one of these like standard performances, and there was some sort of like multi-faith like ceremony, just like one of these standard things that happens at the White House. And this
Interfaith, Mike, interfaith.
Interfaith, sorry. Interfaith. The German boys choir performed, and soon after the performance, a rabbi gave a speech, and within his speech, he made a few references to the Holocaust. That doesn't sound that strange, but later that evening, Richard Nixon is describing this to his staff, and he was very disturbed that the rabbi brought up the Holocaust in front of the German boys.
Oh no.
And then he goes on to complain to H.R. Haldeman that the Jews will never stop talking about the Holocaust. They kind of play around with like what the actual number of lives lost during the Holocaust.
Oh shit.
And then Richard Nixon starts like really kind of laying out his views of just Jews in general, that they're always seeing therapists. They have a death wish, and there's other things that are far more grotesque. I bring this up because what set this off was just a rabbi giving what seems like a pretty standard speech.
Yeah.
And probably, if I had to guess, I haven't found the speech, but probably said something along the lines like there's lessons to be learned from the Holocaust. And that set Richard Nixon off.
Yeah.
The president of the United States, who could not deal with a pretty standard speech coming from a rabbi. And I think that gives you a sense of how deep rooted his anti-Semitism was.
Yeah. Wow. And think of also that rabbi wanting to influence the next generation of young Germans, and he had this opportunity to say, we remember, and you don't have to become alt-right, new right, whatever. Yeah. And
I'll also add, because when we talk about Richard Nixon's relationship to Jewish Americans, people frequently bring up the fact that he saved Israel, by providing shipment of weapons to Israel in the Yom Kippur War. And that certainly did happen. Richard Nixon plays a very important role. But your listeners should be aware of the fact that in the early days of that war, Richard Nixon was pretty much out of commission for close to a day because he was very stressed out by Watergate, and he drank too much, and also had a kind of a prescription of a weird a heavy dosage of uppers and downers. And there was just one day where he just was not responding to any phone calls. And
Yeah,
Henry Kissinger even told several people that he was essentially the president that day.
yeah.
So
I've heard.
even when it comes to this telling the story of Richard Nixon saving Israel, you have to at least include a mention of the fact that Nixon is pretty much bombed for, a very important amount of time in the early days of that war.
I'm sure you've heard anecdotal evidence that he drank heavily and wandered the White House halls as his presidency was unraveling, talking to different portraits of other presidents. Is that true? Have you heard that story?
Yeah, that comes from Woodward and Bernstein, and even though Nixon defenders will target them in different ways, I haven't seen anyone that like actually deny that specific story, and it makes sense because I think of a different story where Richard Nixon visited the Lincoln Memorial in May of 1970.
Which is
Uh,
in the Oliver Stone movie,
it
Nixon.
is,
It's
it
kind of a
is,
great scene.
yeah,
Anthony
yeah,
Hopkins playing Nixon. Go ahead, Mike, set it up.
yeah, so that scene is mostly true. There's one thing that's a distortion, but yeah, what happens is it's May 9th, 1970. It's 4 in the morning, and it's a few days after the Kent State massacre, where students are killed at Kent State University by the National Guard. Anti-war protests are erupting across the country. This is the famous student strike, where hundreds of college campuses shut down for the rest of the semester. And there's going to be a large gathering of protesters in Washington, D.C. What ended up happening was you had 100,000 people gather in the nation's capital. It's kind of the culmination of this student strike. White House officials were so concerned about the president's security that they actually surrounded the White House with school buses. There was a fear that, based on what happened at previous anti-war protests, that people would actually try to scale the walls and try to invade the White House. And so the reason I'm explaining all this is you have buses all around the White House, and Richard Nixon can't sleep night of May 8th, morning of May 9th. He did have a drinking problem, but that drinking problem was made worse by the fact that he was also on a lot of medication. And that's why it didn't take much for him to slur his words on the tapes. Defenders will say, oh, Richard Nixon was just a lightweight. Well, there's a reason he was a lightweight. It's because there was a lot of other things that he was consuming. And so at approximately 3 or 4 in the morning, Richard Nixon tells his limo driver that he wants to take a trip to the Lincoln Memorial because he wants to essentially talk to Abe Lincoln. He sees himself as living through a second civil war
Mm.
as the president who's presiding over the Vietnam era where the nation's coming apart, and he wants to, get some sort of inspiration from the statue. And so with just a few Secret Servicemen and his limo driver, they take the 1 or 2 mile trip to the Lincoln Memorial. And who's there? Well, a few dozen college kids who are there to protest Tricky Dick. And they're in sleeping bags. And some of them had actually just fallen asleep, and they wake up and they see the guy that they're protesting standing just like 20 yards away from them. And what happens is for the first 10, 20 minutes, they have a really awkward conversation. One of the witnesses there said it was akin to like a dad kind of coming downstairs and checking on their kids during a sleepover with their friends. It
Oh,
was that kind of vibe. And
yeah.
so Nixon tried to connect with students. He talked about surfing because he would frequently visit his home in San Clemente, California. He talked about college football because one kid was from Syracuse. He talked about his Quaker upbringing and how he thought that Neville Chamberlain was right because he had this Quaker upbringing, but he then realized that, well, no, Neville Chamberlain was wrong. Winston Churchill was right. And he was trying to use that famous Chamberlain-Churchill comparison to explain what was happening in America and in Vietnam in 1970. And that's when a bit of a debate breaks out. And what happens is more White House advisors who are in a panic because they're justifiably afraid of another assassination of a president. They come and they gather the president. He takes photos with this one individual, Robert Mustakas. He's a Michigan-based Maoist who drove all night to meet up with his friends, and he's the only one who actually took photos of this. You can
Wow.
find the photos online. They're remarkable. Bob Mustakas is this guy like with a big beard, long hair. He said he was on acid that day. And he's the one guy who documented that moment. and then sold his, photographs to all the news wires. But what Oliver Stone documents is part of what I just told you. But then one of the protesters confronts Richard Nixon and says, "You can't even stop the war if you wanted to." And then Anthony Hopkins, as Richard Nixon, tells his staff, that girl, she knew something that it took me decades to figure out, that I'm not really in control.
So that is the part that's ahistorical that you
That
wanted.
part is, yeah, that part is made up. I mean, who
Right.
knows? Maybe Richard Nixon felt that later on. I don't know. But in that moment, he certainly did not feel that way.
Right.
Um, and if he did, I don't think he would have told a, random 20-year-old at the Lincoln
Right.
Memorial.
It sounds like something Anthony Hopkins might have just improvised.
It could be. It could be. The Oliver Stone movie does, though, with that scene, it does capture just how close Richard Nixon came to having a nervous breakdown in that moment.
Yeah.
And that in the spring of 1970, 4 years before he resigns, there were, close advisors who were very afraid of Nixon's well-being. He was just someone that if he was, if he was going through a very stressful moment, it was very clear to everyone. After the Lincoln Memorial visit, he actually takes his team, his entourage, to the Capitol. And at the Capitol, Richard Nixon wants to sit in his old seat when he was a first-term congressman.
Oh.
And he's sitting there, and he makes his limo driver give a speech about the American dream. His limo driver is a guy by the name of Manolo Sanchez. He's a Cuban American, and he gives this kind of impromptu speech about how proud he is to be an American. And Richard Nixon is sitting there clapping. And just picture the other guys who are watching this, and you get, they were freaked out. H.R. Haldeman called it the weirdest day thus far in his diary. And then after that, they then go to a diner. The name, I apologize, it's the name escapes me, but they go to a diner where Nixon has a hearty breakfast, and then he passes out and sleeps for a couple of hours.
Sounds
And
like prom night or something.
yeah, so I bring that story up because it makes the story about him talking to portraits all that more believable.
Oh yeah. It makes
And
the portrait story seem just sort of like a baseline, yeah.
yeah, and it's why in the final days, weeks, or even months of Watergate, there's whispers of Nixon's, like, people are afraid that Nixon is in a really dark place.
Yeah.
And that sparks more rumors about what's the future of the country? What is he going to try to do? Is he going to actually try to, become a dictator? I don't think we ever came that close, but because of all those whispers and rumors that were baited, that were based in some sort of truth, people were just, I mean, I think a lot of the American public were worried about, what kind of guy is actually in charge of the country.
Yeah.
And the tapes, while there are certainly moments where Richard Nixon shows off his intelligence and he's a real foreign policy thinker in many ways, and this is where he's different than Trump. I mean, he's a smart guy, but there's other moments where the caricature of Nixon is not that far off from what you hear on the tapes.
Right. Right. Let's see. I wanted to talk about the book Chaos, but before we go to Chaos, there was one last Nixon thing. Oh yeah. Post-presidentially, Nixon never, and correct me if I'm wrong, but never said the deep state took me out, the CIA took me out. He was critical of the CIA. The Richard Nixon Foundation has some videos, and Nixon saying, I never thought they were very competent operationally, but he never actually said Watergate was a conspiracy against me, right? And he had ample opportunity and a platform in which to speak his truth, if that was his truth, which it wasn't, was it?
No, the closest he came, and I'm not exactly sure if this was the only time. I would actually think there was probably a few other interviews where he did this, but his move was, some say this. And so he would love to put those theories out there. He would make reference, not by name, but he would reference the fact that there was, a popular book out there by Len Clodney called Silent Coup that makes this argument. That the CIA had a lot to do with this. And he would say, I don't buy that, but some will say this. And then he would link that to his critiques of the CIA and the fact that, he wanted, if it was up to him, he would make meaningful changes to the CIA. And then he, of course, would just kind of his goal was to make sure that his crimes were not seen as exceptional by the American people. And so if promoting conspiracy theories about Watergate helped his case, then he did that. But he did it in an indirect way where he still, once again, wanted to be seen as a normal president. And so the some will say kind of approach to that is as far as he was willing to go. People who were close to Nixon, some even who worked in the Richard Nixon Foundation, went a little further than that. That was his approach.
So we don't miss it, let's tell the story. You're a veteran of the Nixon Presidential Library, and you are also there as the library, which was being run by the Nixon Foundation, got taken over by the National Archives, and they brought in a sense of historicity and accuracy, and they got rid of the whitewashing Watergate exhibit, and they brought in a more historically accurate exhibit. So there's controversy here with the Richard Nixon Foundation not being super happy with the National Archive, but you worked under the first federal director of the Nixon, Tim
Naftali.
Tim Naftali, right? That's right. So tell us about this controversy, Mike.
Yeah, and I'll have to discipline myself because it's very easy for me to get bogged down in the details. But
Laser focused.
uh, but first off, I think it's important to explain to your listeners what is a presidential library. There's a lot of these things spread across the country. You know, there's an Abraham Lincoln library, there's a Calvin Coolidge library. But when we think of a presidential library, you're probably referring to the federal presidential library system. And that's something that Franklin Roosevelt created that was meant to, he was thinking about ways to not only store his archive, but also kind of amplify his legacy. And so he created the presidential library system, grandfathered Herbert Hoover. So from Herbert Hoover all the way through George W. Bush, you have this presidential library system that's run by the federal government. However, each of the libraries operate as a public-private partnership.
Ah,
So traditionally, what happens is the library is built with private funds, but the day-to-day operations are usually split between the National Archives, the federal government, and the private foundations. The exact split varies on the agreement, but it's usually something close to like a 50-50 split in terms of who controls what and who pays for what.
I did not know that. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
So Richard Nixon was at the time the one exception to this rule, because Richard Nixon, for obvious reasons, had an exceptional relationship to the federal government. He was still suing the federal government to get back his tapes. He wanted that the federal government seize his records. He wanted access to his records. And so he had a very contentious relationship with the federal government, which is why in 1990, 16 years after he resigned, he opened the first private presidential library in decades.
Oh,
It existed outside of the National Archives. And that at the time was seen as pretty strange, but necessary for those who wanted to promote Richard Nixon's legacy. And it opened in Yorba Linda, California, Richard Nixon's birthplace. And it existed as a private entity for 17 years. What changed? Well, the then director of the Richard Nixon Foundation, he was actually the second director. The first was Hugh Hewitt, who's a conservative media figure. He actually had to resign after he embarrassed Richard Nixon and other advisors because he told a reporter that Bob Woodward would not be welcomed at the Nixon Library, that they would screen researchers before they let them into the library. And that was a kind of a mini scandal in 1990. So Hugh Hewitt steps down. This other guy named John Taylor, who was an advisor to Nixon, but he was referred to as kind of the in-house liberal, Southern California liberal, younger guy, never worked in the Nixon White House. It's someone that Richard Nixon hired in the early 1980s and worked with Nixon to the very end. So a very different experience. And he is the director of the Nixon Foundation from roughly like 1990 through 2009. He thought it was in the Nixon Foundation's interest to make a deal with the National Archives for two reasons. One, there was a financial incentive. It means that, they didn't have to pay for every single bill to keep this place going. But two, he sincerely felt it was the best way to promote some of the better parts of Nixon's presidency. That more scholars would take Nixon seriously if you actually had a meaningful partnership with the National Archives. And he was open to revising certain exhibits. And so that led to the first federal director being hired, Tim Naftali, a Cold War historian who had previously worked at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, and he was brought on board in 2007.
And he
And
recruited you, and you also worked on making that Watergate exhibit more
yeah,
historical, right?
yeah, and so there was this mandate to try to bring in more real history into the Nixon library. It was I joke sometimes, but it was kind of the library's New Deal era. uh, and what Tim was able to do for the first couple of years, he brings in a lot of different speakers who never would have been in Yorba Linda, California. Everyone from left-wing journalist Bob Scheer to John Dean himself spoke at the Nixon Library, and then later on Bob Woodward came to the Nixon Library. Someone like Rick Perlstein, author of Nixonland, spoke at the Nixon Library. And so it was a place where anyone who wanted to share their perspective about Richard Nixon could come. And yes, I was hired as a graduate student in 2010, first as an intern and later as an assistant to the director, to help in the final stages of the Watergate exhibit, which your listeners can look up the details of that history. It's a long 4-year battle to get this exhibit to the public, but I was involved in the last stages. And what that meant was, kind of, last minute edits, doing some research for certain sections of the exhibit, and also helping out with the library's ambitious oral history project. And what the Watergate exhibit does is essentially just lay out the facts of Watergate. And our goal was to explain Watergate in a way that was quite similar to what we would get from a high school history textbook. That sadly was seen as a kind of radical act, because what was there before was an exhibit that told tens of thousands of people who pass through this museum every year that Watergate was essentially a coup of a sitting president. It doesn't dabble in conspiracy theories, but it basically says like the media worked with Democrats to bring down this guy on trumped up charges. The Watergate exhibit that's still there to this day, I don't know how much longer it will be there, but the one that we put up in 2011 used predominantly Republican sources. And that's where the idea for my book came, is that we had oral histories with Republicans who were disturbed by what they learned about Richard Nixon,
Right.
who threatened to resign, and in some cases did, particularly during the Saturday Night Massacre, and just basically told the public, this is why Richard Nixon was forced to step down. It wasn't just about politics. Sure, it's partially about politics, but it wasn't just about politics. It was about the public finding out about a scandal that directly implicated the president of the United States. The other thing that I think was important with that exhibit was that the story started with the release of the Pentagon Papers. It did
Right.
not start with the Watergate break-in. Because if
Right.
you start with the Pentagon Papers, that's when you see how central the figure is, central of a figure Richard Nixon is in this story. If you start with the Watergate burglary, that's when you can get caught up on, all right, was this all about John Mitchell, or was it just about Howard Hunt, or G. Gordon Liddy, or McCord, or what did Richard Nixon really know? The short answer to that is it doesn't really matter, because what he does after the release of the Pentagon Papers sets in motion, what we know as Watergate.
The creation of the plumbers to stop any more leaks, like Daniel Ellsberg, who worked at Rand and had access to this Pentagon report that said Vietnam was unwinnable, and that really was a huge victory for freedom of the press that the New York Times and Washington Post elected to publish those things.
And that same summer, you have what's known by Nixon historians as Watergate West, where the plumbers unit actually broke into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office
In LA, right.
in Los Angeles, and they leave some drugs behind to make it look like a homeless person broke in. No, these were guys who were on the White House's payroll. What did Richard Nixon know about that specific operation? Well, the Watergate exhibit includes a tape where John Ehrlichman tells Richard Nixon, we had a mission out in Los Angeles that had to be aborted, and it's best that you don't know the details. And Richard Nixon says, agreed. So Richard Nixon's a smart guy. I think he was able to kind of connect the dots, and he probably knew that that mission was related to Daniel Ellsberg. This was not just a bunch of kooky guys off doing their own thing. The president was closely watching what they were carrying on in late 71 and early 72.
Right. Well, good. I've been waiting to ask you about something related to 60s history and the meltdown of the counterculture and the meltdown of the breakdown and hippies and anti-war movement going off the rails because you made a great recommendation to my wife that she buy for me a copy of Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s by Tom O'Neill. And in my wood shop in Brooklyn, everybody loves this book. This guy, yeah, there's got this guy there that actually his wife knows Tom O'Neill, and so it's an amazing book. And I think I understand why you like it, because it describes an era that we're both fascinated by, late 60s, early 70s, and it's well researched for 15 years. This guy was on the story of Charles Manson. And the stuff that he unearths is pretty mind blowing, and if you have a taste for some of the best in conspiracy theory, this guy gets dragged backward into the JFK assassination cover up unwillingly. The author Tom O'Neill doesn't want to go into JFK, but there's a relationship between somebody who might have been involved in Charles Manson's programming, and he also, his name was Dr. Jolly West, and he might have. He definitely did have a relationship to Jack Ruby and scrambling the mind of Jack Ruby. So this is a long question, Mike, and I'm sorry that I'm not getting to the question, but tell me why you found value in this book, and how does it relate to your analysis of the 60s and 70s?
Well, I was recommended the book by a friend. What I like a lot about the book, I guess the first thing that I loved was just the character profiles. I mean, there's so many interesting characters that pop up in this book.
Yeah,
Uh, all these guys who are just such California characters.
yeah,
Whether they have ties to the music industry or they're former cops or or both. Um, and so I love that. I think O'Neill is a pretty good writer. He's a very impressive researcher.
yeah,
And also, I just love that there's a book that plays around with different conspiracy theories that does not come to a set conclusion, because
I know what you mean. Yeah,
even concedes, like, look, this is what I think might have happened, but there's not a smoking gun. And so what the book does is it's, even if it doesn't exactly prove anything, it kind of lifts the veil on just how strong the surveillance state was in the 1960s and 70s. I'm sure it still is to this day, but uh, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover and with the FBI and then also the CIA, I don't think younger people really appreciate just how important the surveillance state was in terms of the unraveling of the new left or any other social movement, kind of left of center social movement of the 1960s, 1970s. It plays a very important role. I'm not one to think it was the only contributing factor to the roadblocks or the outright failures of the new left, but it's something that you need to confront when talking about the mistakes made by 1960s activists. It's something that so my current project is a biography of Tom Hayden.
I was
Uh,
just going to ask you about this. How does this
yeah.
relate to, since you're Tom Hayden? Give our listeners the quick overview of who Tom Hayden was.
Yeah, Tom Hayden, co-founder of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, the author of the Port Huron Statement. It was not Lebowski who wrote the first draft of the Port Huron Statement. It was Tom Hayden. Later on, becomes one of the more known national leaders of the anti-war movement. Goes to Vietnam several times. One of the leaders of the famous 1968 protests at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
With Abby Hoffman and Jerry
Yes.
Rubin. And
He was
yeah,
depicted by Eddie Redmayne in the recent movie on Netflix, Trial of the Chicago Seven, and probably is mostly known for being married to Jane Fonda. Was married to Jane Fonda from 1973 to 1989. Later on became a state legislator, was in the both state assembly and state senate in California, and was always involved in various activist causes on the left. But one of the key sources for this biography I'm trying to write is his FBI file. Uh,
right, which was like 4 feet tall, right?
yes, yeah, and that's because the FBI started looking into Tom Hayden when he was 20 years old. He wrote an anti-J. Edgar Hoover editorial for the University of Michigan student newspaper, The Daily, which was a well-known student newspaper, but nonetheless, he's a student journalist offering a critique of J. Edgar Hoover, and that's when the FBI surveillance begins.
Wow.
I think like, your listeners need to confront that, and there are, think about not only Tom Hayden, think about all the other people who did not become Tom Hayden, who were perhaps a student journalist at, University of Connecticut or University of Massachusetts, wrote a piece, they get an FBI file, maybe they go to a few demonstrations, but they don't know that they're being watched. And so that's something that comes up a lot because it also shapes a lot of Tom Hayden's decisions and also probably explains some of his mistakes because mistakes were made by the New Left, but they were often, not always, but often shaped by this constant fear that they were being watched and listened to. And I think that often led them to think that they were living through a, a revolutionary moment in the late 60s and early 70s when you feel like you're not in this day-to-day war with the state.
Right. Right.
But in terms of how it's connected to chaos, I like I said, the book just shows that it's a part of the history of the 1960s that doesn't get discussed enough.
Right. I personally, and I'm going to just say this so you can react to it. It's even though Tom O'Neill does not kind of tie up all the loose ends at the end with like a thesis statement or a conclusion or a synthesis. I think what chaos does is it exposes COINTELPRO, it exposes Operation Chaos, which was the CIA's domestic operation to infiltrate the New Left and the 60s counterculture. And it explains why these Manson cult people would engage in cold-blooded murder against people they didn't know for no apparent motive. And, they were also tripping a lot on acid and might have been mind controlled, or there might have been some sort of form of hypnosis, or because Dr. Jolly West might have had an influence on Manson and might have taught him mind control or some kind of hypnosis or some kind of cult control of people. So it just kind of opens up the hood and it helps explain how this might have happened, because I think a lot of people feel like that act ended the 60s and kind of ended the or subverted the anti-war movement. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly part of the narrative of the 1960s. To make a Hayden connection, there was a debate within parts of the New Left about the meaning of the Manson murders. Now infamous moment where Bernardine Dorn of what's about to become the Weather Underground in December 1969 tells a crowd of a few hundred people in Flint, Michigan, dig it, when she's talking about Charles Manson or Manson's followers digging a knife into Sharon Tate. And she's basically celebrating that act. In the front row of this event was Tom Hayden and his then partner Ann Wiles. And the fact that they're there, I think, was very meaningful because it meant that they wanted to have a connection to this part of the left. But after the event was done, they actually condemned Bernardine Dorn to her face and said, what you said was disgusting. How could you say that about, a woman who's pregnant being murdered by the Manson followers?
Yeah.
And I bring that up because, all these people are being spied on, but they come to different conclusions about what's an appropriate way to analyze this big media, tabloid media event. On one side, you have people who will go underground and will spend years and years of their life underground. And on the other side, you have people who are, doing provocative acts, but they're not willing to go that far. And they're not willing to celebrate the Manson murders.
Yeah.
But COINTELPRO, I mean, the first thing I can think of is Tom Hayden's, one of his closest confidants and co-organizer of the 1968 protests was Rennie Davis. Rennie Davis was part of the Chicago Seven. And after years and years of full-time organizing against the war, he has some sort of nervous breakdown, if you can call it that. And then by 1974, he's following a Indian guru who's 15 years old. And he spends the next several years of his life doing that. And Tom Hayden and other people who knew Rennie Davis speculated about what happened to Rennie. And the consensus is the stress of day-to-day organizing just got to him. But they speculate about his LSD use and whether or not the government had anything to do with it. And they at least play around with these theories. while they're mourning what happened to his, their friend. So there is this awareness. This is possible.
Oh yeah.
Even if they weren't believers, they were not completely shutting the door on that. And it's because, one of the more interesting parts of Hayden's life and one of the toughest parts for me to write about is when he's in Berkeley during the Chicago trial. And you don't get this from the Aaron Sorkin movie. He's living in a commune called the Red Family, where they're going and they're off doing target practice and they're practice karate. At certain points, they're even suturing their wounds to practice what they would have to do during a firefight with the cops. Now, this sounds insane. And if one of your friends told you they're doing this, you'd be like, well, this is really strange. And however, you have to remind yourself, these are people who were in Chicago when Fred Hampton was murdered, essentially by the federal government.
Yeah.
These were also people who were in different situations where their own homes were shot at. So if you're living in this kind of like siege mentality that's rooted in a real threat to your life, is really that crazy? Not to say that that's something I would do, but as a historian, the context is important. So I bring that up because these were people who were very aware, even if they wouldn't have called it the COINTEL program in 1970, 71, they were living it. And
Right.
when this all comes out by the mid 1970s, and that post-Vietnam, post-Watergate, church hearing moment, it confirms everything that they had been dealing with for years and years and years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, great, Mike. This has been an amazing conversation, and I thank you so much for your time. And is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to cover? Any questions for me?
That's a good question. I mean, well, one thing I often ask people, I mean, like, when did you first hear about Richard Nixon?
Well, I was born in 71.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit older than you, and I lived it, man. I lived it.
Well, still, I doubt that you remember being a 3-year-old.
No, no. I asked my parents who was the king of America, and they said, we don't have a king in America. We have a president. His name is Ford. And that was easy to remember. So I remember President Ford. I don't remember President Nixon
Yeah.
per se, but I remember a lot of hippies and
Yeah.
a lot of guys with beards. And
Well, the reason I ask is because I think another reason people are drawn to Nixon is whether it's his looks or his just kind of aura. He doesn't seem like a president. He sticks out.
he does stick out. The nose
I,
sticks out. The caricatures of his nose being kind
yeah.
of like a
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. His voice sticks out.
yeah,
The way he sticks out.
yeah,
It really jumped out to me. And it may partially explain why some people are drawn to him in a positive way. They're like, hey, look at this guy. He's an awkward looking guy. He's not good looking in the conventional way, yet he managed to become president of the United States. And I'm sympathetic to that to a degree. It's a very compelling story. But
yeah,
what I often tell people is, look, this is not just some random nerd. This guy became president of the United States. I think, he had his victory by going from this like, lower middle class, if not outright working class, like guy from Southern California to the Oval Office.
yeah,
Uh, the real tragedy, if not his failure, was that he could never get over these resentments, and he could never actually celebrate that he was president of the United States. And instead, he got too caught up in the culture war that we're still living with today. And that's why he
yeah.
matters. But I do understand to a certain degree why people are drawn to him. He's far more interesting than most U.S. presidents, and that's why I can't stop reading about him.
I see. People love an underdog. I think that's universal. People
They
love,
they love
yeah,
an underdog, but can a president of the United States really be an underdog? I guess there's certain situations. I just don't think we've lived through a historical moment where a president is in fact an underdog.
yeah, yeah. What we're going through right now with Trump is also breaking all the rules, kind of like Nixon broke a lot of the molds, and it's also mostly not good, like Nixon. So thank you for standing for truth and for history and for serving your country and serving the truth about American history, even if there's opposition and opposition both loose and light and flippant and serious and well armed. So thank you, Mike, for being on the show. Mike Koncewicz. All right. Woohoo!
Thank you.
All right, Mike. I'll talk to you later, man.
Yeah. See you around.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Hey folks, just a quick message. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe. Why? Because we've got content nobody else has. I'm Sander Hicks. I'm an activist, spiritual, political, Quaker, Zen, into nonviolence, into creative construction and carpentry, into investigative journalism, reporting, and winning elections for the progressive Democratic left. So please like and please subscribe. Peace.